Back to diapers. The air seemed to ripple outwards from the book, as though it were the source of a gas leak. The two mommies were truly frozen, unblinking, unflinching. The same was not true for Brian and Rachel. They could still move all right, but they were nonetheless frozen where they were, unable to move out of terror. What could possibly be happening now? Already they were sitting on potty chairs, buck naked, watching kiddie cartoons. They shuddered to think this could get any more embarrassing. As the ripples swept out with the first changes they saw came to the toys on the floor. Dollies and Lego blocks seemed to implode in on themselves, then morph into simple plastic letter blocks, clown-faced rattles and other baby toys. Something large began to grow out of the floor, expanding like a fast-growing flower until it snapped into shape, a playpen. The wavy air reached the two adult toddlers next. Brian leant back on his potty as he felt strange energy beginning to flow over his bare skin. As he tried to push away as though his space was being invaded by an aggressive puppy, as though simply scooting back and looking away could stop it, the potty chair beneath him began to melt away. He fell to his bottom with a thud as the potty disappeared into the carpet as though swallowed by quicksand. The potty gone, Brian scooted back on his bum, his limp penis brushing across the carpet as he tried to escape the unknown forces assaulting him. Rachel abandoned her potty as it too sunk into the carpet, though it felt plenty firm under her bare soles. It was no use running though, for the process seemed to gain speed with every passing second. The energy passed over and through the duo. Rachel's mouth tingled, her gums aching as several teeth receded up into them, leaving nothing but bare pink gums in their place. Her dark hair turned lightened several shades, not going blonde, but certainly not as dark as before. It also became thinner, wispier as her pigtails vanished. Brian grasped at his mouth as he too lost several teeth. Then he was distracted by something more concerning even than that. His legs felt strange, fatigued and twitchy. He rubbed at his calves, trying to see what was happening to them, though they looked no different. With a thud, Rachel dropped to her bottom beside him, looking particularly surprised. And Brian knew, she hadn't meant to sit down at all, her legs had simply given out. Her bared bottom didn't smart for long though. A second after she hit the floor, a crinkly white diaper appeared out of thin air, wrapping itself around her loins. Rachel hoped a shirt would materialize the same way, but she had no such luck. As the ripples seemed to dissipate, she was left sitting on the floor in only a diaper. As a stillness returned to the air, the mommies began speaking again as though nothing had happened. "But what can you do? They grow up so fast," Sarah declared. "Yep, my little Megapoo is just crawling up a storm these days. Why, she'll be walking all on her own in no time. How cute," Sarah gushed. From the way they were talking, Brian guessed he and Rachel were now little more than infants. Aside from the playpen and baby toys, the room hadn't changed that much, but he guessed his bedroom would be much different now. MMMPH, Rachel grunted, trying to stand up but finding her legs uncooperative. Brian shook his head knowingly. He wasn't foolish enough to try that himself. He could feel the weakness in his legs. He knew somehow he'd lost the ability to walk. Rachel dropped onto her stomach with a bang, painfully landing on her bare breasts. She grunted and sulked, sticking her diapered bum in the air and showing off the puffy white garment decorated in a pattern of light green rattles and teddy bears. Amanda and Sarah looked over at their babies and shared a chuckle at the little girl's difficulties. Then Sarah clucked her tongue at Brian. "Well, what happened to your die-pie, little mister?" she asked rhetorically, heading over to her boy. "Did you wanna get all nakey-wakey? Did you?" she cooed in baby talk to him. Brian shook his head and tried to quickly explain. "No, I didn't wanna go nake. Bwan quotes." As soon as the words left his mouth, Brian knew they had come out all wrong. He'd thought the normal words in his head, but the messages got garbled on the way to his mouth, and then his tongue seemed to be all clumsy and tricky to control. Before he could correct his poor diction, his mom was picking up a big pack of diapers and addressing Amanda as though he hadn't said a thing. He was being completely ignored. He's such a little nudist these days, she told Amanda. I think I'll have to start taping his diapers onto him. He gets his hands on the tabs and next thing I know there's a rip and he's streaking through the mall with his weenie hanging out. Oh, I'm sure Meggie will be just the same once she figures out how to get those dear pies off. Could be, Sarah agreed, setting the diaper box on the floor and opening it up. Brian looked at the side of the box. It showed a picture of a young man around his age lying on his back in nothing but a diaper and pulling at the toes of both feet as he waved his legs in the air. The man had a glassy-eyed soporific look on his face, grinning like a contented idiot as he played with his feet. Above him the brand name Huggies was emblazoned across the package. In the right corner were the words, crawling early walking boys 16 to 22 years. Sarah drew out a big white diaper with blue teddy bear prints. She unfolded the bulky garment while Brian tried to calm down and concentrate on speaking properly. He found that if he was less excited it was easier to control his tongue properly. Mama, I don't wanna be, he started, speaking slowly and clearly. I know you want to be naked honeybun, but this isn't our house and you can't be making pee-pees and poo-piss on our friend's carpet, Sarah cut him off. Brian reddened with frustration. He wasn't saying he didn't want to wear a diaper, he was trying to tell her he didn't want to be naked. Why wouldn't she let him finish what he was saying? Sarah knelt at his side and gently pushed him onto his back on the carpet. Okay honey, don't squirm while I get you dressed. Be a good boy for Mama, she urged him in that awful high-pitched voice. I won, Mama, Brian assured her, nodding. He was determined to show her he wasn't some stupid little baby. Sarah lifted Brian's legs, slipping her head between them and placing one calf on each shoulder. Then she used her body weight to push Brian's legs upward, lifting his butt in the air just long enough to slip the new diaper under his butt. She grabbed some lotion from the bag beside her, squirting it into her palm and then reaching forward. Brian's eyes widened and he felt a flush of shame as his mother's hands began to rub his exposed penis and all around his crotch. This was an all-new height of shame for the young man. To have his own mother actually manipulating his former manhood, simply to keep it clean when he inevitably wet and messed his new diaper, was so demeaning it made Brian want to cry like the baby he was being treated as. There we go, that will keep Mama's whittle guy nice and comfy in his dear pie, she told him as her hand slipped under his raised bottom. Brian closed his eyes and sniffled as he felt the cool greased fingers slip up and down his butt. He felt so violated, so powerless. He couldn't help but wriggle his legs, wanting to pound his heels on the floor. Honey, don't squirm. Remember, you promised Mama you'd be a good boy. I'm a bad boy. Brian squealed, the tears starting to escape the corners of his reddened eyes again. Then show Mama how you can hold still, she replied. Brian forced his legs to be still and Mama's hand left his bum at last. Then she had a bottle of powder and she was dusting his pee-pee and bum with it. The smell of the baby powder was overwhelming to his senses. It seemed they were becoming keener. Every touch, every scent was magnified. He could feel every cool fleck of powder settling on his pee-pee and bum. Mama put away the powder and began to take the diaper closed, finally giving him a speck of privacy. It was a big, bulky diaper and it came all the way up to his belly button. But it also forced his legs out slightly. As he moved them he could feel the crinkly material brush across his smooth hairless thighs. Once it was fully secured, Mama let his legs go and then directed his arms up, slipping a red t-shirt over his head. It wasn't like his earlier t-shirt though. It had writing on it he couldn't read, but the real change was its length. This shirt was only half length, not quite reaching his belly button. Dressed in this baby tee and diaper he felt like Tommy Pickles on Rugrats. As he turned onto his knees and attempted to stand, the t-shirt left his tummy uncovered. Brian was beyond this small shame though. He had experienced so much worse now that being half-clothed no longer fazed him. In fact, it no longer even bothered him that his legs were totally exposed or that he was barefoot. All that mattered was he proved to himself that he was at least still able to stand on his own 2 legs like a man. He just wanted that one small dignity to be left. It took all his strength to force his knees to lock into place, his legs straightened. They felt weak all right, but more than that he felt like he was standing on a rolling, pitching ship's deck. His toes flexed and his knees wobbled as he tried to keep his balance. He was forced to hold onto the couch for support. Rachel was staring up at him, chewing her thumbnail anxiously, slowly slipping more and more of the digit into her mouth. The mamas were beaming at him like he'd made a great accomplishment in simply standing up. "Look at that, Sarah, your little one is quite advanced for his age. 21 years old and he'll be walking around the place on his own in no time," Amanda commented. "Yes, he's quite good at standing and he can even walk a bit as long as I hold his hands. But he's not quite ready to tool around on his own yet." "I can walk," Brian blurted out indignantly. "Well, he certainly has the right attitude," Amanda noted. "And he's quite the little talker, isn't he? Very advanced for his age. Oh, he's gonna be quite the chatterbox pretty soon, no doubt about that. Most grown-ups have a hard time understanding his babbling, but Mama knows what her whittle guy wants. Mamas can always understand their baby's language. He seems eager to do a little walking. You want to give him a hand?" "Yes, he could use the practice. But get ready for some crocodile tears when he falls down," Sarah warned. Brian pouted. He hated the way they talked about him like he was deaf. Here they were mocking him while he stood right in front of them, and they went on as if he couldn't understand a word they said. He was determined to show them he could do more than walk with someone holding his hand. He'd just been running around the backyard minutes ago. He would force his muscles to work properly. Mama came up beside Brian, smiling as she took his hands off the couch and into hers. She pecked a kiss on his cheek, smiling as she looked him in the eye. "Okay, honeybun, let's go for walkies." Brian felt even more off balance as Mama led him away from the couch. She walked backwards, keeping a firm grip on his hands and her eyes locked on his, smiling encouragement the whole way. Meg's Mama was also smiling and nodding her praise as she watched the walking lesson. Rachel didn't seem impressed at all, of course. She just sulked on the floor, now fully sucking her thumb. Walking was tricky indeed. The change wrought on Brian's body by the last shift had done a number on his abilities. His motor skills had taken a very serious hit. With each step his leg jerked upward rather than smoothly lifting. He stepped too high, all his movements exaggerated, awkward. His foot would then slap down hard, toes turning inward. With each step his body swayed left or right, pitched forward or slipped backwards. Only his mother's firm grip on his outstretched arms kept him standing upright. "There we go, lift those toeses, get them up and set them down," she directed. "Very good, Bree. You're making walkies just like a big boy. Mama is so proud." As she praised him, Brian felt an odd sense of accomplishment. Sure, it was silly to be proud of something so basic, but given the problems with his body, this was an achievement. He found himself beginning to smile, even to giggle with giddy pride. Mama led him all across the room and he didn't fall down. That made him feel so big, walking just like Mama. For a second it didn't even occur to him how ridiculous that thought was. Then Mama set his hands on the door jamb by the entry the dining room. She brushed a hand through his hair again and gave him a big smooch on his forehead. "You did very good, honey. Mama knows that was tough for Bui, and she's glad you tried." Mama started to walk away, but Brian had to follow her. He'd made it this far, surely he could do a couple steps on his own. Tentatively he let go of the jam and took a furtive step forward. His legs wobbled dangerously, but he continued. He swung his right foot past the left, going for his second step, but as it set down his foot rolled on its side and his knee gave way. Next thing he knew, his arm and cheek were slamming into the carpeted floor. Out of shock, Brian began to wail. Falling like that was so disorienting, he didn't know what was going on. He didn't just sniffle and tear up, this time he was bawling his eyes out, unable even to see straight. Mama spun around as soon as she heard the thud of his body hitting the floor. He'd only given a couple shrieks before she was at his side, pulling his lanky 6-foot form into her lap and cuddling her arms around him. Sure, there, little guy. It's okay now, Mama's here. I got you and you're all safe, she sung to him, rocking gently back and forth. Brian wanted to stop, but once started it seemed out of his control. His emotions were on a roller coaster ride now, impossible to keep a hold on. He sobbed even as Mama's warm arms cuddled him close and he felt her kisses pecking the top of his head. Mucus poured from his nose and dribbled over his lips. Where'd you get hurt, sweetie? Where are those bad boo-boos? Mama asked, looking over the young man's face and arms. Did they hurt you here? Is this the bad boo-boo? She asked, gesturing to his right arm. Let Mama kiss them all away then. See, Mama kisses them and makes the boo-boos all better, she told him, kissing his arm and cheek. Slowly Brian felt his emotions coming back under control. It had been like trying to stop a speeding train, getting them in check, but he felt much better now that Mama kissed away the hurt. In fact, it was the surprise of falling more than any actual pain that had made him cry. As his tears dried up, he realized there wasn't actually any pain. This made him feel even more foolish. That's better, isn't it, Brie? You feeling better now, baby? Brian nodded, still sniffling a bit as he said, so I CWY Mama. Oh, that's okay, honey. Don't worry, Mama knows what baby needs when he falls down and goes boom. Baby just needs kisses on his bad old boo-boos. That makes them all better because Mama has magic kisses. Brian giggled despite his shame. Somehow the idea of his Mama having magical kisses was both ludicrous and wonderfully comforting. On an intellectual level he knew that was made up, but somehow it seemed perfectly possible to him on an emotional level. He trusted everything Mama told him without question. His tears dried up and a smile on his face. Mama lifted Brian out of her lap and set him on his butt on the floor, getting him a few toys to play with while she went to prepare the baby something to eat. Brian wasn't interested in the silly red and blue letter blocks Mama had left him, so he got onto his hands and knees to crawl over to Rachel. Creeping about that way really was much easier and safer than trying to walk. As much as it demeaned him to crawl, he didn't want to have another meltdown like a moment ago. The idea of walking now really scared him. Wackhell, you okay? He asked his friend as he reached her side again. Rachel was still sitting right where she'd been the whole time, sucking her thumb vigorously in an apparent daze. She hadn't moved or said a word since the last transformation. She wasn't even making any attempt to cover up her bare breasts. Brian was worried that either the transformation had warped her mind or it had simply snapped under the strain. The diaper-clad young woman turned to him, showing her sorrowful eyes. They stared at each other for a long moment before she removed her thumb with a pop and mournfully announced, I done got teeths. Rachel was pouting and looked on the verge of a meltdown herself. Brian shook his head and corrected her quickly. You got teeths? Can you fee em? She opened her mouth wide, revealing a mouth with several gaps where teeth hadn't popped through the gums yet. Look it, they all gone. Just some of em. Most. It's okay. We gonna be okay. Rachel shook her head, determined things would not be okay. How come we can talk good? Sound all dum-dum. Brian shrugged. Cause a DA book. It do Edwarding. Rachel looked angry now, very angry. She turned to a toy playset nearby and bashed it with her fist. The toy rattled and made several dinging noises. It was brightly colored and plastic, of course, covered in bells and things that could be turned and twisted, knobs and levers. As soon as she'd hit it, Rachel found her attention drawn in by the bright, noisy toy. She pulled at a blue tab sticking out of the contraption and it immediately produced a satisfying ripping noise. She hit the bell next, then twisted a multicolor dial, resulting in a crunching sound. It was so engrossing. As she played with the toy, Brian crept up next to her, bopping the bell experimentally. When it rang, he too smiled mischievously. Soon they were each banging away at it, twisting and pulling the gizmos, having a grand old time with the Playskool baby's toy. They barely even noticed when the mamas reappeared from the kitchen. "Well, I'm sorry to put an end to the fun, but it's time to fill those tum-tums up with nummy-nums," Sarah announced. Brian didn't really want to put aside the toy. He was really having fun with it. It made so many cool noises and, wait, cool noises? Brian blinked in astonishment as he reflected on what he'd been doing. He was a college student, he still looked like one, aside from his teeth and hairlessness. Yet he'd been happily playing with an infant's toy for going on 5 minutes, if not longer. In fact, he'd been so engrossed he'd actually lost track of time. And from the look of Rachel's face, she was having a similar revelation. Getting messy. Before he could ponder his strange behavior anymore, Brian felt Mama's arms scooping under his own and lifting him off the floor. How Mama was strong enough to lift him onto her hip and carry him was beyond his understanding. He could only assume it was the work of the book, altering certain aspects of the laws of physics. Mama carried him into the kitchen, where 3 high chairs were lined up along the counter. They were huge chairs, of course, built to accommodate college-aged men and women. Each was white with a footrest and a detachable tray. As Mama set him down in one of them and strapped him in, he got a look at Meggie for the first time since their latest transformation. Their former friend was dressed just as Rachel was, in nothing but a diaper. She was sat on the linoleum floor of the kitchen with her back against the baby-proofed cabinets with a pot upside down between her legs, another one on her left foot and a couple smaller ones scattered across the floor nearby her. She was drumming away at the pot between her legs, making a cacophony of sound, while chewing on the black plastic handle extending from the pot. Amanda was busily preparing food for the babies while her daughter banged away, legs jerking this way and that, a line of drool running down her chin and dripping to her bare boobs. Sarah locked Brian's tray into place, rubbing his cheek lightly. "Okay, Brie, we'll have you all fed in a jiffy. Let me just get your little friend Rachel to join you for dinner." A minute later she returned with Rachel on her hip and set her down in the chair on Brian's left. Amanda scooped Meggie up from the floor and carried her to the remaining high chair. "Mama, Baba, Gabu," Meggie babbled as her mama strapped her in. "Yes, sweetie, you'll be having a nice milky baba very soon," Amanda assured the eager girl. Brian was disappointed to see that Meggie's mind had been reduced along with her motor skills and speech. She continued to babble cheerfully and blow raspberries or spit bubbles throughout their meal. She seemed completely unconcerned with staying clean while eating, not caring at all that much of her meal ended up on her body instead of in her mouth. Not that he and Rachel were doing much better though. The Gerber's baby food being spooned to them from orangey glass tubs with blue labels tasted disgusting. Not only that, it looked repulsive too. Brian forced himself to swallow the gook, but Rachel gagged and spit it back up several times. It wasn't long before she had it all over her chin. Unable to stomach any more, she began to twist her head back and forth in an effort to avoid Sarah's attempts to feed her. The result was some very messy cheeks as well. "Ugh, no more," Rachel whined, but to no effect. "Come on, sweetie, eat it all up like a good girl," Sarah encouraged her. When this failed, she tried pretending to try the gook herself, proclaiming, "That's yummy yummy," and rubbing her tummy in mime for the girl. Rachel didn't believe it for a second, of course. She sulked and closed her lips tight, refusing to allow another spoonful of the sludge into her mouth. She was already despairing at how filthy she was from the meal, especially compared to Brian. By accepting the feeding, he'd kept himself relatively clean. The Looney Tunes bib tied around his neck to protect his t-shirt was barely even necessary. Rachel and Meggie didn't have bibs because they had no shirts to need protection. Instead, their bare chests had both gotten good and messy. Though Meggie wasn't as concerned as Rachel, she was busy painting her chest with the spilled food like it was her new favorite game. Well, at least you did a good job, Brie, Sarah told him, though mostly for Rachel's benefit. Now you get to have a treat, she said, beaming as she put a piece of chocolate cake on his tray. Brian loved chocolate cake and was eager to get some in his mouth. His fingers manipulated it poorly though, crushing the cake and getting his hands coated in frosting. He brought a handful to his mouth, smearing his cheek and dropping crumbs down his bib and onto his diapered lap. He sucked the frosting and crumbs off his fingers and palms, no more concerned with neatness than Meggie. By the time the treat was finished, Brian was a very messy college boy. Mama had to clean off his face and hands with a wet nap, the same as she did for Rachel. I do it. Rachel had tried to insist. But Sarah had ignored the squalling girl's pleas and cleaned her up. Next time, honey, you need to let a grown-up get you clean right now. No. Rachel repeated. Sarah and Amanda shared an exasperated look, continuing to clean up their charges. Once the kids were relatively clean again, Amanda placed a rattle on each of their trays while she went to prepare their bottles. Meggie took to banging hers on the tray, then discovered it was just as fun to chew on it. Brian gave his an experimental shake and was soon engrossed in playing with it. He used it as a drumstick, a conductor's baton and a maraca. Rachel refused to get suckered into playing with a baby toy again. She was determined to keep her mind intact. So she simply shoved hers off the edge of the tray, letting it drop to the floor where it was well out of reach. Careful, hun, you shouldn't throw your toys away, Sarah told the girl, picking it up and placing it on the tray for her again. Rachel said nothing but stared the woman in the eye as she shoved it back off the tray. The toy slammed into the floor with a terrific clatter. Sarah shook her head reproachfully and picked up the rattle again. This time she held it out before Rachel and enticed her. Come on, baby girl, don't you like your toy? Listen to the lovely sounds it makes. Rachel shook her head no, willing the woman to leave her alone. But then the mama was shaking the toy, and it was so bright and colorful. It moved back and forth and made these funny, indescribable sounds. Rachel wanted to look away, but it was entrancing, the shifting colors, the rattling noise. She found herself reaching out and the smiling friendly lady slipped it into her hand. Shaking it herself was doubly gratifying. Why had she ever been upset about being given this silly toy? It was so much fun. Okay, honey, time for your milky BABA, the mama announced, breaking her concentration on the rattle. Rachel looked up out of her daze to see Sarah holding out a BABA filled with milk for her. It was one of those crooked baby bottles that were supposed to be healthier or something. Rachel shook her head, putting out her hand, palm flattened, to refuse the bottle. Okay, so she'd played with a rattle, that didn't really make her a baby. She wore a diaper, okay, but she hadn't actually used it yet. No, she was not really a baby. She wouldn't accept a BABA. However, that nipple did look enticing. Memories of having her thumb in her mouth came flooding back. It had started as nail-biting, a bad habit sure, but not infantile. But having something in her mouth like that had felt deeply satisfying on a level she couldn't have imagined before. The more of her thumb she'd taken into her mouth, the safer, more relaxed and peaceful she'd felt. Now that big rubber nipple on the BABA seemed to be calling to her. If her thumb had felt that nice, what would a nipple BABA be like? How could she refuse to find out? No. She couldn't just give in like that. Rachel shook her head, closing her eyes tight and trying to force herself not to think about the thumb, or the nipple before her. She was an adult, a college student for God's sake. She had to get a grip on herself. The rubber nipple brushed across her lips, lighting up the nerves there. Instinct took over and in a split second her mind betrayed her and Rachel sucked the nipple into her mouth. She bit down and suckled on it, immediately being rewarded with slightly warm, creamy milk. She suckled and swallowed, letting it squirt across her tongue and cheeks and roll luxuriously down her throat. It made her warm all over, inside and out. She drifted away from her worries, lost in pleasurable sensations. With her eyes only open a crack, she could just make out Brian and Meggie enjoying their own bass filled with yummy milk. They too looked just as happy and peaceful as could be, suckling away. When the BABA was all done, Rachel found she didn't really want to stop suckling. It was like an urge she had now, to suckle, to keep something in her mouth. She only stopped when Sarah eased the bottle away from her. Rachel wasn't happy to give it up at all. She reached out for it desperately and squalled. "Mine. That mine," she screeched at the woman. "Shush now, dear," Sarah told her. "I think someone's getting a bit sleepy and cranky after her BABA. Time for this little one to have her nappy poo." The tray was removed and Sarah undid the belt, keeping Rachel in her seat. The woman didn't lift her out immediately though. Instead, she leant closer and cuddled Rachel into her arms, rubbing her bare back. It wasn't the same as having her mama do it, but being held and cuddled was still very nice. Though she was confused when the gentle rubs turned to patting on her back. The next thing she knew, something was rushing up her windpipe and she opened her mouth to burp loudly. A second loud burp followed shortly thereafter. "Ooh, that was quite a burp. You must have really enjoyed your BABA to get so much air with your milk," Sarah told her. With that, she set Rachel down on the kitchen floor, letting the girl rest on her hands and knees while she lifted Brian out of his chair and began patting his back the same way. Rachel watched her diapered, bibbed friend get burped by his mother, letting out a series of lengthy burps while he rested his head on her shoulder. "There we go, that's a good boy, get it all out," she crooned to him. Once Brian seemed to be all burped out, Sarah lifted him out of his seat and set him on the floor with Rachel. Amanda lifted Meggie out of her seat and carried the grinning big baby out of the room, cooing baby talk to her. Sarah set about cleaning up the sizable mess they'd made, leaving them to creep on the floor. After a couple minutes of that, boredom set in and the duo got restless. Brian grabbed one of the pots Meggie had left on the floor, tapping it lightly. Rachel reached out and touched his wrist. "Don't do it. Wook's dumb," she told him. Brian shrugged. "Look at what I wearing," he said, gesturing to his diaper. "Already wook dumb." Rachel conceded the point, letting his wrist go and watching him bang at the pot, hitting it over and over. She could see that something about making noise satisfied him. He looked entranced. In fact, she could feel a growing need to make noise herself. Maybe she could just give the little pot a bang. She started to reach out for it. "Well, how's Mama's little Ringo doing? Are you gonna be a rock star someday, honey? Mama's drummer boy?" Sarah asked Brian as she appeared leaning over them, drying off a tray with a paper towel. Rachel yanked her hand back as though the pot was burning hot. She'd almost given in, almost acted like a stupid little baby again. It was getting harder to fight it. The younger they were treated, the less bodily control they had, the stronger the urges became. It seemed like an instinct she had to fight. Her body wanted to do infantile things. Brian, for his part, enjoyed Mama's silly tone and playful questions. He even smiled up at her, banging loudly on the pot, until he saw Rachel staring worriedly at him. The smile disappeared in an instant, and he blushed with shame at acting so foolish, like he was enjoying being treated like a baby. Mama's praise made him feel all warm and fuzzy inside, but Rachel's cold appraising gaze reminded him that this wasn't natural at all. "So we, dunno what I was thinkin'," he told her once Mama was gone again. "Don wanna end up weak, Meggie," she reminded him. Brian nodded gravely. No, he certainly didn't want that. The sounds of rolling wheels could be heard then, coming closer and closer. The rolling sound was interspersed with high-pitched giggles and squeals. Brian and Rachel looked towards the living room, wondering what was going on. As they looked, Meggie appeared back around the corner. She was in some kind of odd contraption. She was standing up, but she was also sitting down. She was in a saucer-shaped vehicle with several wheels like would be on an office chair. Her bottom was suspended in a stretchy seat that wrapped around her crotch, allowing her bowed legs to dangle so her toes brushed across the floor, allowing her to propel herself about without actually walking. The whole contraption was a giant-sized baby walker. It was yellow plastic with a red seat. There was a tray before her with Sesame Street characters built into it, lighting up when she bopped them with her hands. So as she jolted the walker left and right with her uncoordinated leg thrusts, she was also eagerly slapping at the figures on the tray, crowing her delight as they lit up. "Oh my, that is so lovely." Sarah gushed as the bare-chested college girl hopped up and down in the stretchy seat and banged at the tray. "I know, isn't it? She just loves making her walkies in the thing. You know what, I have just the thing for Bree too," Amanda exclaimed, hurrying back into the living room. She returned pushing a second adult-sized baby walker. It was a bit more basic than Meg's, colored simple gray and lacking toys on the tray. "Meggie loves her new one with toys, but I think Bree would fit in her old one perfectly." Sarah nodded in agreement and soon Brian was being pulled away from his pots and lifted into the walker. He felt the stretchy material slip around his thighs as he was lowered. It caught him and suspended him in the air. It was an odd feeling, being able to just feel the floor brushing back and forth across his toes. "It's a perfect fit," Sarah declared. "Excellent, these things are really good for keeping them out of trouble, you know. They can't quite reach anything to get hurt and there's no falling down. But I'm afraid they do bang into a lot of stuff, so put away anything breakable." "I'll keep that in mind." Rachel felt a bit left out watching Brian and Meggie bump into each other in their saucers. She was still stuck down on the floor, her useless legs folded up beneath her. Silly as they looked, they at least allowed her friends the dignity of being at the same height as the grown-ups. As she sulked on the floor though, Rachel soon discovered much more pressing concerns. Her stomach was cramping, forcing her to bend over. The cramping moved downwards, into her lower abdomen. She moaned as she felt it continuing to move through her, fearing what was about to happen. Sure enough, her recent meal had triggered her digestive system to clear some room. She needed to make a poopy, and she needed to make it soon. She wanted to hold it in, but her sphincter muscle seemed to have lost all its tone. She couldn't seem to clamp down at all. She really did need this diaper after all, she had lost all control. That was a painful fact to admit. A knocking at the door distracted Rachel from her dread for a second. The mamas looked up and Sarah glanced at the clock. "Do you think it's her?" she queried. "Hello, hello, hello." Joy's voice called from the front foyer, answering Sarah's question. "Hi Joy, we're in the kitchen," Amanda called out. Joy came in carrying Danny on her hip. Though he was nearly the same size as her, and looked ridiculous with his long gangly legs wrapped around hers, Joy seemed to have no difficulty carrying him. The teen baby was wearing a yellow terracloth onesie that left his legs and feet bare. A matching yellow and white Pluto pacifier bobbed back and forth in his mouth. He seemed oblivious to the world, staring with empty eyes up at the ceiling.